I am here with Red Sox beat reporter from MassLive and Fenway Rundown host Chris Cotillo. So, Chris, how we feeling about the Red Sox?
If the WBC is any indication, they're going to go 162 and 0. So that is, Jaron Duran's been great. Roman Anthony and Masataka Yoshida have been great. Bayo pitched well the other day. Greg Weissert is, a national star in Italy. So everything's coming up Red Sox in the WBC. But I think more seriously, they've had and I haven't been there for a couple weeks, go back for the last week here, but it's been a pretty tranquil, easy type of camp where they, just have not dealt with big time injuries. They've not dealt with any type of controversy. They haven't dealt with, horrible performances, really. They have been, just kind of chugging along in advance of getting to Cincinnati in 2 weeks. And that's all you can ask for this time of year. We learned that a year ago.
Real quick before we get into it, I think our listeners might find this kind of funny. The first time you and I ever did a podcast, it was on Bo Sox Talk, and we were talking about the 2020 or the 2018 like cheating scandal, and it was funny because guys like Kevin Pillar, Jackie Bradley Jr., Andrew Benintendi, were all fighting for outfield spot, and just looking back and preparing for this episode, it was just funny, kind of looking at how things have sort of changed just in general.
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed it just from a coverage standpoint. Like I started on the beat in 2018. Um, and there's nobody that is still on the team that was on the team then. There's nobody. Devers was the last one. But even by that point last year, you look back to even 2021 and how many guys are left. Whitlock and Hauk and I know Duran debuted that year. It's really not many. So that's just the game. I think the Red Sox expect Anthony, and Crochet to be here for a really long time. Their contracts are, not 15 years long, but you get them into their 30s. So they're trying to build that core, and I think that's, I realize a lot of time how many different players I've covered, and I've also done like a sporkle of, players who have played under Alex Cora in a Red Sox uniform, and I couldn't get them all. I missed like 50. You forget about the Marcus Waldens of the world and Robbie Scott and different guys like that. So it's been a journey, but I feel like they're at the point where, they're at the beginning of that window of contention that they keep talking about, and that's a really good sign for fans.
Right. Completely agree. Obviously, made the playoffs last year and now, made some good moves this past offseason. Now it's go. Young guys are here, locked up a lot of guys. And, one player that I've heard you guys talk a lot about on Fenway Rundown, and he's kind of the biggest wild card, is Masataka Yoshida.
Mhm.
There was some reports, you mentioned it from some rival executives that, if all four outfielders are healthy on opening day, it's tough to really see Yoshida where he fits on this current roster. So, we've seen him kind of going off in the WBC. Who knows if that could potentially help him in his trade value? But where do you think that situation will kind of go as opening day gets closer?
I mean, it's still nothing's really changed. I mean, maybe his trade value's increased a little bit, but he's still attached to, 2 years and 36 million over the next 2 years, which is nothing to sneeze at for a limited player. I think the world knows he can hit, but he can't field and he can't run, and the power comes and goes, and that makes you really limited. And the types of teams that could want you, the types of teams that could need you. The Red Sox are not one that needs that profile. I mean, people, they could definitely use offense with the way the roster is constructed, but they could use offense at another spot other than left field where they already have basically Duran and Anthony as options with one of those other two DHing. So, in a perfect world, they could find a way to move him. But do you move him for pennies on the dollar, when he's a guy who looks healthy, showed out in the WBC, and could help your team? It's just, I always think the perfect way for them to build this team in the offseason would have been, offloading one of the regular outfielders for a really good pitcher. Um, they instead chose to sign one in Suarez and trade young arms and Fitz and Clark for Gray. Then they just kept trading pitching pretty much all the way through, other than moving from the password, who he's even more buried than the guys they have now. So it's still dysfunctional in that way. But I think the good news is if one of those top four outfielders goes down, you still have, ready-made options. But at a certain point, if everybody's healthy, and that's what the Red Sox hope, where does Yoshida play? Where does Casas fit in? Where does Christian Campbell fit in? Does he have a role? Those are all questions. The flip side of it is, by the time they got to October last year, Nate Eaton was starting in the outfield, Nick Sogard in playoff games. So these things tend to figure themselves out. But as we sit here 2 weeks, clear spring of opening day, I think it's hard to envision how it all pieces together.
Yeah, and so if all four outfitters are healthy, like how do you think that like how do you think it's going to play out? Like, do you think there's a potential that they option him? Like, let's say there's like no trade partners, he doesn't want to get optioned. Like, they just could DFA him. Like, I don't really know how he fits.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, I think you have, Brayu playing right every day, Rafaela playing center every day, probably, Anthony 75% of the time in left, Duran 25%, and the other one DHing. You're going to get some of those guys off their feet here and there. So, Rafaela is obviously supreme in center field, but we know he goes in prolonged slumps. So maybe you give him a break or 2 days or something. At that point, maybe Yoshida is just a bench bat. You come in and bring him in as a pinch hitter. He can take over in the outfield. It's just like it's a very expensive player in that spot. But you look at the good teams. The Dodgers every year have too many good players for spots theoretically too. The Red Sox hope that they do. But it's just a very weird. They're all so similar, left-handed hitting outfielders, and that's just obviously their games are different, different talent levels, different contracts. But when you break it down to left-handed hitting outfielders, the four of them that they have are good players if you count Yoshida in that bucket, but you can't play them all at the same time. And then that doesn't even begin to start the question of like where Campbell fits in, which I think
Yeah.
is totally something no one talks about. So yeah, it's a weird roster in that way, but one that they're gonna have to figure out.
And it's funny too that like we're talking about like they got to trade Yoshida, maybe option him, and he was one of the best hitters for them down the stretch, and especially in the playoffs. But as you mentioned, like throughout this spring training, there's no controversies, nothing crazy, especially compared to last season. But there is a few players that are fighting for spots on the major league roster. One of them being Marcelo Mayer, and we heard a week or so ago Alex Cora sort of alluding to that Mayer needs to earn his spot on this team, and a lot of people throughout this offseason, especially before they traded for Caleb Durbin, sort of already penciled in Mayer into that second or third base spot, especially after Bregman left. And you've kind of been somebody who's downplayed, sort of the talk on Twitter, especially of, everybody kind of freaking out when Cora first said that. And, maybe they don't believe in the player, bringing up the injuries, everything like that. But like, how do you think, the team has started to feel about Mayer as the weeks have gone by since those comments, especially since he's come out and sort of said, I agree, I do need to earn my spot. This is the Boston Red Sox. And let's say he doesn't make the team, how they kind of position those guys with Durbin probably at third base and maybe IKF and Monasterio at second base.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all just to use a baseball term, eyewash from Cora, really. I think for two reasons. Number one, just Marcelo Mayer is not at a place where he, was a really productive big leaguer for a year, and so therefore those guys are not promised jobs. That's just the way the league works, where William Abreu's established himself, or someone else has established himself over time, and those guys get jobs and roles and roster spots that are just penciled in. The Red Sox want Meyer to feel like he has to fight instead of being handed the job, and so that's going to be the narrative publicly. The second part of that is just Alex Cora playing the contrarian. It's been something he's been doing all spring for whatever reason with the media. It's usually just me, but I didn't even ask that question. So he is just basically being like, you guys are all penciling Meyer in, but he's going to earn a spot. And I think, in a camp where there's not much going on, honestly, especially in talk radio circles, that took on a life of its own. I mean, I haven't been down there in 2.5 weeks, but still have a pretty good pulse, of what's been going on. And like, I think the public perception of that whole thing was kind of way off. And you look at even narratives like, you know, well, they're not giving him a spot because he won't agree to the contract they're offering him. What we've heard is that they were hesitant to make an offer because of the injury history, which is a legitimate thing and probably how they should be playing it. But these things take on a life of its own in the absence of real news, controversy, debate topics, all that type of stuff. I mean, I think a much Better debate is whether he should play third and Durbin should play second, which I can see both sides on. But more, it's like, do the Red Sox hate Marcelo Mayer, which is total BS, and I think people just looking for something to talk about in a slow time.
I agree, and I think it for Meyer, like if he does get the chance to be on the major league roster, it's a great learning experience for him, obviously, to be around all those major league talents in the clubhouse and to be able to continue to learn and grow, especially against lefties. But if he did get sent down to third base, I mean, he really didn't get that much time down there. Injured majority of the time he's been in the minors and hasn't really played a full season just yet. So in my mind, it's one of those things where both options are great for development, and obviously, if he makes a major league team, probably a little bit better for his confidence and just his long term outlook, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I like nothing's changed to me. I thought there was about a 98% chance he'd make the team when camp opened, and I'm still right there. I mean, and part of it's because maybe if like Campbell was gonna play second or like somebody exciting like that from an offensive perspective, and I know he's been up and down, and some people are more down on him than others. If he was in the mix at second, maybe, but you're really going to start like also Romy Gonzalez is out of the mix. That's the guy. Those are two guys that you could see making a push, but this group is not inspiring. I mean, Monasterio is a throw-in that trade. Um, Sogard, is what he is. IKF, like he's a good defender and a good clubhouse guy, but you're not going to give him 400 plate appearances. And Meyer has more upside with the bat and kind of the same defensive floor. So, um, yeah, I just like I don't see who the challenger for at bats at one of those spots is. If you had somebody else who was pretty good, or if they wanted to maybe challenge a healthy Romy Gonzalez to take over against righties and lefties, which they're not going to because he might need shoulder surgery. Like I could see it. That's just the thing. Like who else is it going to be? And I don't see any of those names popping out.
You brought up Romy, and you just made me think of something, especially with how it all played out. Do you think that they had an inkling about his shoulder issue when they signed IKF, and then obviously when they got Monasterio and the other infielder in the Driven trade?
Yeah, that's got to be the reason, and it's just the timing of it is Romy had a an issue in the last week of the season. He played through it because he was going to be so important in those games where they're facing Fried and Rodon, and he's a lefty masher along with Refsnyder then, and he played through because it was the playoffs and wanted to just slow it down after the season and see how it got, and it really hasn't gotten worse. It just hasn't gotten better as we sit here on March 11th, and I think they kind of knew based on he might and those types of determinations on surgery will be the last the next 24 hours or so probably, but um, I, I don't think they would have made those types of moves had they had a full um, like full go Romy. And now we see why they added so much depth because, think about that week of, they went from basically, two open spots to, waiver claims for, Chang and Gasper, even though he's more of a catcher. And then, not just, Durbin, but obviously Monasterio and Siegler in that deal, signing kind of for Lefa, signing Rogers, like, that group has even dwindled now. I think Rogers would have had a pretty good shot if he had a good camp. And obviously, he might be out for months, as it has been the case too much in his career, unfortunately. So they made those moves. I think once they kind of got a sense of how hurt Romy was. I don't know if he's going to be out for the season. I do know it's not going to be the first month or probably anything close to that. That's just based on reading the calendar.
Yeah, that has to make sense because even listening to your guys' podcast, it's like IKF 6 million, make that make sense. But as
Right.
we've talked about, there's a few other guys who are fighting for roster spots. Conley early, Payton Tolle, two of the top prospects on the pitching side for the system. And you actually put out a good tweet talking about their service time implications with early. If he's down in AAA for 5 total weeks, the Red Sox will get control with him from 2032 instead of 2031. And then Tolle, it's 46 days with the same kind of control. But in terms of those two guys, do you think it's likely best for them to start in AAA, not only in terms of the service time aspects, but also the development?
Yeah, I mean, they were definitely exciting early, more consistently, and totally, especially, in the Pittsburgh outing and here and there, and the way he pitched all year, really exciting down the stretch. that doesn't mean that they weren't rushed. I mean, you think about how they got there, and you know, uh, basically they had three guys go down in a couple of weeks, and then Giolito at the end. But they had, Bueller. They couldn't go with that anymore. They sent him to the bullpen, then released him. Uh, they wouldn't have done that if they knew that Richard Fitz was going to get hurt. He did like 2 days later. So now he's out of the mix, and then Dustin May gets hurt, a week later, and those are the guys that they thought would be able to fortify the group behind, Crochet, Bayo, and Giolito. Giolito runs out of gas. He was pitching hurt in September, gets hurt and can't pitch in the postseason. Dobbins is already out for the year. Criswell was hurt at that time, and he was a guy that would have come up. I mean, they were decimated. And so they had to go, basically to the three guys they did. Kyle Harrison there at the end, but Harrison, Tolle, and early. And it started the service clock earlier than they wanted. It started them being on the 40-man roster earlier than they would have wanted. That's a big thing where, they've had two spots clogged that they didn't think they'd have to this offseason because those guys weren't even Rule 5 eligible yet. Um, and if they didn't make it in September, you probably would have looked at them in the bucket of definitely starting in AAA and maybe coming up mid-season. But because they've already gotten a taste of the majors, people look at them differently, and I think rightfully so. But I think they like Oviedo. They want to see what he can do in that spot. If he flames out and he's not very good in April, they can send him down and hopefully by that point have Cutter Crawford and Patrick Sandoval ready. And so with that, like they have, three kind of bona fide major leaguers with different levels of experience, more than Tolle and Early, where they can slow play those guys. If Tolle comes out and has a 1.25 ERA in his first six starts, and Oviedo is not pitching well, and Crawford and Sandoval are up and down, then, I think you have to at a certain point say, service time be damned, let's go win games. And it's always that balance. But they've built this in a way where they've insulated themselves with, adding Suarez, adding Gray, adding Oviedo, keeping, Sandoval and Cutter, and just seeing where they go with it. That being said, if one of the main guys gets hurt tomorrow in a start, then either Tolle or Early, probably Early, will be in the opening day rotation just because he's healthy, he's ready, and Sandoval and Crawford are not. But these are all real considerations, and I think it's smart business to get, those are their age 29, 30 years we're talking about in free agency. Those are like the prime of a pitcher's career. They can wipe that out, of course, if they get an extension done with them in the next 3 weeks. We'll see if they're even trying that. But it's just part of the puzzle, something every team goes through. And that's another conspiracy theory with Mayer that doesn't really come into play because he was on the big league roster for virtually, the whole year. When he was on the IL, that counts. So service time's not really at play with him.
Yeah, I agree. Especially with how Tolle skyrocketed through the system. And then, obviously early, I think only had like six starts in AAA. And, kind of like you said, one of those things where look at the service time, look at the development. And also, you've also mentioned multiple times that with Oviedo, just because they gave up the password in a trade, didn't slot him in automatically in that fifth spot. But he's pitched pretty well. Three starts, 8 innings, no earned runs, 9 strikeouts. And so do you think he's securely locked into that fifth spot?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a very totally locked him into that spot when they acquired him because that was before um, Suarez. And at that point, you didn't know Suarez was going to be the two or the three, whatever you want to call him, probably the two. And I think Garcia is probably a flawed player in some ways, and he wasn't going to have much value here, but he still was a top 100 guy on a lot of lists, and that's what you gave up to get Oviedo, who's a guy that a lot of team analytically driven teams have liked. So um, minor league options are super super valuable to these teams too. And the fact that he has options remaining, as do Tolle and Early, obviously, is super valuable. Where it looks ridiculous that you would option someone at sometimes, but you can with if someone's struggling, you can just send them down. And we saw if Tanner Houck didn't get hurt last year, he was probably going to get optioned because of the way things were going. We're talking about could Connor Wong get optioned now? He's a guy that hasn't played the minors in 4 years. So it's just a reality of the game, and building up that depth, giving yourself different possibilities, especially in the rotation, is what good teams do. And if I think they're, insulated to the point where, they have, like we've been talking about, really, they're almost nine deep when you talk about, Crawford and Sandoval, who are not that far off. And, Crawford's a guy to me who has been so forgotten about and so slept on because he was out last year, but had a really, really good year for them 2 years ago, is kind of a bulldog and a guy that, if healthy, can be a middle of the rotation innings eater, which is going to be important at some point this year.
Completely agree. And, as we've already spoken about with this starting pitching and just pitching in general being decimated at the end of last season, like never going to have too much starting pitching. And, we both know Craig Breslow loves pitching, if anything. So, but one last thing that I wanted to talk to you about, I think he's one of the most, mystery guys on this team going into this season is Triston Casas. Obviously ended last season at the beginning of the year with a severe knee injury, ended up getting surgery. And you actually spoke to him a few weeks ago about his recovery. And, Corey even alluded to him moving around way better than he expected him to. And, he mentioned that he's looking to start most likely with an affiliate, but obviously would like to get back up to the MLB club at some point this season. When do you think we can see Triston Casas back in Boston?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a matter of giving him a long runway. Opening day was always an aggressive target. He's obviously hitting in the cage. I could see him doing a rehab assignment for all of April at some level, whether that's Worcester. And then at the point where that's over, determining two things, like number one, is he ready? And number two, is there a fit? Because if Yoshida's still on the team, and the DH spot's already clogged up, and Contreras is healthy and playing well, like it's confusing where that'll be. And it's another guy who you haven't seen play in the minors other than rehab assignments for the last couple of years in Costas that could get option just to get down there and prove himself, and that's not ideal for him, especially if he's hitting really well down there, but kind of where he is in his career and what the Contreras trade, it's almost ruthless in a way to do that, but what you have to do if you're the Red Sox. So, I think they look at it that, if Wilson Contreras gets hit by a pitch and mid-April and he's going to be out for 2 weeks, and you have a pretty good backup option that's not like Dom Smith off the street or Abraham Toro like it was last year, or Frankie Cordero or some of these guys. So, there's too much depth in some spots in this team, and there's not enough on others. I wish it was more evened out for their sake. It would be easier for us to do roster projections that way. But Casas is a guy I think still going to have an impact this year. It's going to be a winding road to get there.
Yeah, I think it's a massive prove it year for him. Even, after the injury happened last season, in my mind, it's like you can't run it back expecting him to be healthy. He just hasn't been healthy throughout his career thus far. But I feel like, too, he's kind of like a diamond in the rough of if he does get right and everything does click. We've talked about, or people have talked about the power issue potentially on this team. He could be a guy where if everything gets right, could hit 20 plus home runs. Like we've seen him do it before. And feel like I agree. I think he needs a rehab assignment to get his confidence back up and to get back into that player that made him such a renowned top prospect in the system.
Yep, and a good big leaguer for really, 4 months of that 23 season. And he was off to a good start when he got hurt in 24. So he's such a polarizing guy for, I think, reasons that make fans uh, upset for no reason. And in reality, he has still the potential to be, like I take a long shot bet of him leading this team in home runs. Like even if he's only up there for 4 months, he's proven that he can hit 24, 25 homers in the big leagues in the past. And, when he's on, he's on. We've seen that. And, but again, it's not an easy path. It's not a linear spot or path to a spot.
I agree. And I feel like with this team, it's going to be interesting, obviously, every year how everything plays out. You can never predict injuries or anything like that. But with this team, especially how I think it's built, everything needs to go right, especially offensively. You guys have talked about in your guys' podcast, some guys need career years and everything like that just for the offense to be at the top echelon of the league. But for you, curious just where you see this team at the end of the year. What's your record prediction?
I haven't gotten there yet. That'll be a March 24th prognostication. And I've been off by like one game the last 2 years. I do think what I do know at this point is like the standard for success is to go farther than they did last year. In a really, really crowded American League East that everybody's running into each other. I am not going to say it's win the division or bust just because we've seen, sometimes that doesn't really matter. Obviously, it's good to get home field that would have helped them last year. And it's obviously good to get, buys in the postseason. All that stuff is very real. But, really good wild card teams can go deep too. I think, they're positioned to be, at full strength, a good team in a playoff matchup because you just have that three-headed monster of Crochet, Gray, and Suarez for now. And maybe that's Bayo at the end of the year, or maybe it's early, or maybe it's Crawford or somebody. Like they have so many good starting pitchers that you can bet that you can find three or four of those guys in a playoff series. So to me, the line of success is getting further than they did last year, getting into a DS and potentially a CS. Not going to say it's World Series or bust. And I do think one thing we're going to need to start talking about in a few months, and we're way ahead of the game here, but is just having a better trade deadline than they did. Because I think that people just forget about that and they think about, like they don't think about they think about not getting Joe Ryan, but they don't think about what actually happened. And a few good outings for Steven Matz, and May was a disaster. And you can point to really bad trade deadlines having hurt this team under Bloom and Breslow in a big way. The trade deadline where they just got Luis Urias, and then the trade deadline where they got rid of Vasquez and ruined the clubhouse, but they got Tommy. Like, there's so many weird ones. And then you don't have to look too far to see how, like, Schwarber galvanized a team in 2021 or how Evaldi and Pierce did in 18. So, they need to have a pretty good deadline. They have to get better as the year goes on, something they haven't done enough in the last few. But we'll probably have that on a July discussion instead of a March one.
But nobody wanted Schwarber, right? And no, yeah, you just got me
Right.
fired up thinking back of like we're gonna buy after they trade Devers, and then yeah, Steven Matz and Dustin May, and I just remember the
Yep.
disappointment after the clock ran out. It's like, are you kidding me? That was it. But I think they'll likely probably try and get a power bat or something like that, and who knows, maybe we could try and trade Duran.
Yeah, I mean, those are going to be the open questions. The roster is, I think, finished before opening day, mostly, other than your loose ends. But if these kind of dysfunctional pieces of the roster are lingering into July, then those are questions that'll pop up again for sure.
I agree. It'll be fun to see how it all plays out, but appreciate you coming on, Chris.
Of course, man. Anytime.